I am so sick of the Metroid Prime 4 discourse. I had to put on a mask. I had to avoid the straight up cancer of YouTubers trying to tell you that Metroid Prime 4 is a failure, that nobody's talking about it, that the game is bad, and that that they hated the game. It is embarrassing because, I'm sitting here, talking about the game all the time. I was planning on doing like a video talking about the ending in particular. Let's make a video talking about Metroid Prime 4 because in a lot of ways, I think this game has kind of proven just how out of touch the general gaming community is. They honestly believe that Metroid Prime 4 was some underwhelming thing, that it was disappointing, that this was some failure, that people aren't liking it. In actuality, it basically exclusively feels as if Halo fanboys are upset about Metroid existing. And that is honestly all the backlash towards Metroid Prime has ever been. Is just Halo fans spurging out about the superior first-person adventure franchise. This has been happening since Metroid Prime 1 came out, actually. I remember being harassed for playing Metroid Prime 2 instead of Halo. Where's the multiplayer, bro? Where's the voice acting? Where's the story? Where's the online play? People who didn't know what they were talking about were complaining about Metroid Prime 1 and 2 and would go on to hate Metroid Prime 3 while I was thoroughly enjoying those games. While I really, really got a lot of mileage out of them, and of course, those games eventually went on to become classics. It is embarrassing to see how desperate the gaming community is to downplay Metroid Prime. Because every single time one of these gets released, everyone has this mindset that this is going to be a typical AAA game. This is going to be like Nintendo making a mature game for a mature audience. This is going to be like an adult first-person shooter game. And they're surprised, inevitably, when that turns out to not be the case. Every single time this happens, the audience is filtered by these games, how they're structured, how they play, and they get very, very, very upset at, certain realities when it comes to the Metroid brand. Specifically, how they work, how they structured, how they play. So many people have been complaining about Metroid Prime 4 and the way it's set up, accusing it of being this poorly constructed mess. But in actuality, it's very, very well made and very, very one to play. All the complaints you see about Metroid Prime 4 from people pretending to be fans are all superficial observations. All this weird fan fiction kind of takes on the character and the lore and the setting. Oh no, Samus doesn't have any friends. Why is she hanging out with these people? Why does she care? It's really interesting, right? We went into this being told that oh man, I would love it if at the ending of the game Miles McKenzie died. That's what a lot of people were saying, is that the only thing that could possibly save Metroid Prime 4 is if Miles McKenzie dies at the end of the game. That's what we were being told by these people. And then when it turns out that that's exactly what happens, that everyone dies, you saw them trying to backtrack and trying to say that it was actually a bad ending. When in actuality, it was very good and very heartbreaking. That is the mindset I have when looking at this game and its reception, is that it feels as if the people who are complaining about it don't respect it. They don't respect Nintendo's creative decisions. They don't understand what they were trying to do. And they're just really freaking out over essentially what amounts to the fact that this is not a AAA game from a third-party studio, right? This is Metroid Prime. It's so far above any of that slop, whether it's Mass Effect, Halo, Dead Space, the works. Metroid Prime 4 was a masterpiece, and yet you see a lot of people trying to say that, I was disappointed by it. Oh, nobody's talking about it. It just isn't true, is the simple reality of it. The simple fact of the matter is, Metroid Prime 4 was very, 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 very well received, but as always, it was rejected by the Pretendo audience, rejected by fake Metroid fans, rejected by posers, rejected by people trying to push an agenda. People like Stuttering Craig, who are very desperate to pretend as if this game was somehow like some major disappointment or like didn't feel like Metroid or just like these are people who have not played a Metroid game since like 94, okay, since Super. Like that's kind of what I've noticed, looking at people talk about the series over the years is that the stopped at Super players are like have this very specific idea of what Metroid is, and they get very, very upset whenever it deviates from that formula at all. We saw this with Fusion actually when that one was more linear and structured and story focused. People like claimed that game was like a disaster when it came out. So much so that like I never actually played it until like a decade later, and I was surprised to see how good it was. Honestly, we saw that with Metroid Prime. Like, Metroid can't be 3D, and then, Metroid Prime was well received, and then the narrative kind of shifted to, complaining about how it wasn't a very good FPS. But it's not an FPS, it's an adventure game, and now we're seeing this with Metroid Prime 4, We're seeing the same kind of copes, people complaining about it being structured like a Zelda game, when Metroid Prime has always been very Zelda-influenced. You see people, complaining about, the story and the characters and the setting and the lore and basic mechanics like the scanning. To put it very simply, I, the actual Metroid fan, someone who plays games like Federation Force and Metroid Samus Returns, right? Someone who plays all of the Metroid games, I have the credibility and the platform to tell you that these people are posers and that they should not be listened to ever. Okay, Prime 4 is a perfectly good game. I enjoy it. Everyone enjoys it. The people who are spurging out about it are only doing so out of a sense of obligation to try to grift views out of their audience and to try to say that Nintendo has completely screwed the pooch. And that is a ridiculous claim to make. It's something that doesn't make any sense, especially since this isn't even a Nintendo developed game. This is from a Nintendo subsidiary, Retro Studios. This is one of the most embarrassing situations I have seen in quite some time. And it's very interesting to see just how much of it has completely collapsed and just become completely irrelevant, right? This is the reality of what we're seeing here. The reality of what we're seeing out of this community is that the Metroid fan base has no credibility, okay? They have no ability to talk about games. A lot of them never even finished Prime 4. Stuttering Craig admitted he never got past the tutorial area, right? When you take that into consideration, when you think about that for a minute, you realize that none of the people complaining about this know anything about Metroid Prime at all. And when you think about that, why exactly would you ever listen to someone like that? It doesn't make any sense. None of these people have any credibility whatsoever, and going forward, they should absolutely be dismissed.